Your money is yours found out my husband had been telling his family a lie for 7 years. And the worst part was that I had been funding that lie myself, every single month, out of my own paycheck. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there at that dinner table, holding a fork full of green beans, and I smiled at him. Because in that exact moment, I understood something Marcus never expected me to understand. He had just given me permission to take it all back. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 44 years old, and until that Sunday dinner in February, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. The dining room smelled like roast chicken, and the candles Patricia always insisted on lighting, even for an ordinary family dinner. Marcus's parents sat across from us, Harold at the head like he still ran something, Patricia beside him, dabbing her mouth after every bite. Kristen, Marcus's younger sister, was scrolling through her phone under the table, thinking nobody noticed. My phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down and saw my mother's name. I stepped into the hallway to take it, my chest already tightening before she said a word. "Rachel, it's your father," Susan said, her voice thin and careful, the way she always sounded when she didn't want to be a burden. "The doctor says the surgery went well, but the bills, honey, we're short. I hate to even ask." "Don't apologize, Mom. I'll handle it." I walked back to the table with my chest still hollow from her voice. I sat down, cut into my chicken, and said it as casually as I could manage. "So, my dad had surgery. It went well, but there are some bills. I'm going to help them out this month. I didn't ask permission. I never had to before." In 7 years of marriage, Marcus had never once questioned where my money went, because for 7 years it had always gone to his family. Not mine. Marcus set his fork down slowly, deliberately. The kind of stillness that tells you a storm is loading itself behind someone's eyes. "Your parents, your problem," he said. "Your money is yours, my money is mine." The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already agrees with what was just said and is simply waiting to see if you'll be foolish enough to argue. Patricia didn't look up from her plate, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, approval, barely disguised. Harold nodded once, like a judge confirming a verdict. Kristen kept scrolling, unbothered. Like this was the most normal sentence in the world. Nobody defended me. Nobody even blinked. I looked at Marcus's face, the face I had loved for 13 years, the face I had built a life around. And something inside me went very still, very clear, like water settling after you stop stirring it. Because here is what Marcus didn't know I knew, sitting there so pleased with his own logic. I had memorized every transfer, every payment, every just this once that had turned into every month for the Doyle family. Patricia and Harold's rent, quietly covered since the year they downsized, and pretended it was by choice. Kristen's car insurance paid without her ever once saying thank you. The electric bill every August when Harold refused to turn the air conditioning down. The family trip to the Gulf Coast 3 years ago, the one I'd paid for and wasn't invited to, because Marcus said it was just going to be family. $2,800 every single month for 7 years. Not a single dollar from Marcus. Your money is yours. My money is mine. I picked my fork back up. I even smiled, the kind of smile people give when they've decided not to fight a battle in front of an audience that's already chosen sides. "Okay," I said simply. "That's fair." Marcus visibly relaxed, satisfied he'd won something. Patricia finally looked up, pleased the tension had passed. Kristen put her phone down just long enough to ask if there was more chicken. Nobody at that table understood what had actually just happened. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I had backed down. I hadn't backed down. I had just been handed the exact rule I'd been waiting 7 years for someone to say out loud. I finished my dinner. I laughed at Harold's joke about the neighbor's sprinkler system. I helped Patricia clear the plates, rinsing them under warm water, while she chatted about her garden, completely unaware she was chatting with a woman who had just quietly decided to stop being her bank. Driving home that night, Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand on the console like nothing unusual had happened, like he hadn't just drawn a line in permanent ink. "Dinner was nice," he said. "It was," I answered. watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. I meant it, actually. It had been a very informative dinner. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I already knew what I was going to do. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of arithmetic. If my money was mine and his money was his, then for the first time in 7 years, I was finally going to follow the rules of our marriage exactly as written. Marcus just had no idea yet that the rules applied both ways. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to Marcus, listening to him breathe slow and untroubled, like a man who'd said something ordinary at dinner, instead of something that had just ended an arrangement he didn't even know existed. Around 1 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to my home office. I told myself I just wanted to look at the numbers. That was the polite version of what I was actually doing. I logged into my personal checking account, the one that had been mine since before we married. The one Marcus had never once asked to see, because he assumed correctly that it wasn't his business. I pulled up 7 years of statements. Then I opened a spreadsheet, because I am the kind of person who needs to see a thing in black and white before I let myself believe it. The transfers were all there, tidy and recurring, like a second mortgage I'd been paying on a house I didn't live in. $1,400 a month to Patricia and Harold, going back to the year they sold their place outside Dallas and moved into that rental near us. The one Marcus swore was temporary. $60 for Kristen's car insurance, which I'd started covering after her divorce, and never stopped, because nobody ever told me to stop. Utility overages every summer. Harold ran the air conditioning like it was free. A $4,000 roof repair 2 years ago, which Patricia described to her garden club as Marcus really stepped up for us. The Gulf Coast trip. The dental work. The Christmas gifts Marcus got credit for being generous about, purchased on a card linked to an account he never funded. I did the math 3 times because I didn't trust myself the first 2. $2,800, give or take, every month for 7 years. Not a single dollar from Marcus. Every transfer had my name on it, and every ounce of gratitude in that family had gone to him. I sat back in my chair and let that settle into my body the way cold water does, slow and complete. I thought about every time Marcus had said, "Our family, Rachel." Whenever I hesitated, however briefly, about another request, I thought about the specific warmth in his voice when he defended his mother's spending, and the specific coldness in his voice at dinner that night, when the subject was my own father. Your parents, your problem. Your money is yours. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story about a woman who suddenly discovers she's a victim and dramatically throws a glass of wine. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was calm, unnervingly calm, the way you get when a decision stops being emotional and becomes structural. Like discovering a support beam in your house has been quietly rotting and finally understanding why the floor creaks. I picked up my phone and texted my financial advisor, Denise, a woman I trust more than most people in my life. I didn't call. It was 1 a.m. I just wrote, "Need to talk tomorrow about restructuring some automatic transfers." Nothing urgent. Just ready to make a change. Denise responded within the hour, because Denise never sleeps either. Whenever works. "Everything okay?" "Everything's about to be," I wrote back the next morning. I sat in Denise's office with my coffee going cold in my hand while she pulled up my accounts on her monitor. I told her I wanted every recurring transfer to the Doyle family. Rent assistance, insurance, utilities, all of it. Cancelled, effective the 1st of next month. I also asked her to help me open a new account, separate from anything Marcus could see, specifically to help my own parents. Something clean, something honest, something that wasn't built on somebody else's rule. Denise didn't ask why. She's known me 12 years, since before Marcus, and she has a particular talent for reading a room without needing an explanation. She just typed quietly, confirmed the cancellations, and slid a piece of paper across the desk for my signature. "Done," she said. "These stop as of the 1st. I signed my name and felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. That afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. Recurring payments canceled. Confirmation. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went about the rest of my day like it was any other Tuesday. Grocery store, dry cleaning, dinner with Marcus, where he talked about a work meeting, and I nodded in all the right places. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic announcement across the table. I didn't need one. Marcus had already given me the exact words I needed, free of charge in front of witnesses. Your money is yours. My money is mine. I was simply the first person in that house willing to actually live by it. He rolled over and murmured something about being tired, then fell asleep within minutes. I lay there a while longer, staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely light for a woman who had just detonated something enormous in complete silence. He had no idea what he'd started. He still thought the conversation had ended at that dinner table. It hadn't ended. It had only just begun, and the first payment was due to disappear in exactly 19 days. The phone rang at 8:14 the following morning, and I already knew, before I looked at the screen, exactly whose name would be sitting there. Patricia. I let it ring twice while I finished pouring my coffee, not out of cruelty, just habit. When I finally picked up, her voice came through sharp and clipped, missing its usual sugary warmth entirely. Rachel, there's a problem with the rent transfer. It didn't come through this month. That's right, I said, keeping my voice even, almost pleasant. I stopped it. A pause. The kind where you can practically hear someone recalculating their entire understanding of a person. You stopped it? We depend on that. Harold's pension doesn't cover the difference. You know that. I do know that, I said. But Marcus was very clear the other night. My money is mine. I'm just following his rule. The silence that followed was longer, heavier. Patricia didn't have a response ready, because in 7 years she had never once needed one. I told her I hoped they'd figure it out, wished her a good morning, and ended the call before she could recover enough to argue. Marcus came home that evening already agitated, his tie loosened, his jaw tight in a way I recognized from years of watching him absorb bad news before he was ready to hand it off to someone else. My mother called me, he said, dropping his keys on the counter harder than necessary. She says you canceled the rent payment. I did, Rachel. What is wrong with you? You're punishing my family over one comment at dinner. I'm not punishing anyone, I said, turning to face him fully. You said your money is yours, and my money is mine, I agreed. I'm simply keeping my money to myself the way you asked. That's different, he said quickly, the words leaving his mouth before he'd clearly thought them through. Different how? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched him search for an answer, the way you watch someone pat down their pockets for keys they suddenly aren't sure they brought. It's just, they're my parents. It's not the same as some transaction. It wasn't a transaction when I was covering your sister's car insurance for 2 years either, I said quietly. But I don't remember you calling that different. He had no answer for that. For the first time in 13 years of marriage, I watched my husband stand in our kitchen with absolutely nothing to say. And something about that silence felt more honest than any conversation we'd had in a long time. His phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Kristen's name lit up the screen, and he stepped into the living room to take it, his voice dropping into that low, placating tone he used whenever he was managing his sister's emotions instead of addressing them. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Insurance lapse, cancellation notice, don't panic. Harold called next, later that night, while Marcus and I were getting ready for bed. I heard Marcus's voice shift again, firmer, more defensive. Dad, I'll talk to her. Just give it a few days. A pause. No, I'm not going to let it slide. I said I'll handle it. He hung up and looked at me like he expected an apology. I offered none. I simply pulled back the covers and got into bed the same as any other night. My dad wants to talk to you directly, Marcus said. He says he'll handle this like an adult. He's welcome to call me himself, I said, but nothing's going to change. I'm not reinstating anything. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at his phone like it might rearrange itself into a different conversation if he looked at it long enough. I watched him from where I lay, studying a man I had known for over a decade, confronting for the very first time the shape of a boundary instead of the comfort of assumption. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no urge to explain myself further. I had already explained myself perfectly, in his own words, at his own dinner table, in front of his own family. He finally set the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. But I could tell from his breathing he wasn't sleeping either. 30 days is a strange unit of time. Short enough to feel like nothing when you're waiting for a vacation. Long enough to unravel an entire family's finances when the money that quietly held it together disappears without warning. By the end of that month, consequences had stopped being phone calls and started being paperwork. Patricia and Harold received a formal late notice from their landlord, red print, a deadline instead of a polite reminder. Kristen's insurance company sent a cancellation warning, 10 days to pay in full or lose coverage entirely, which meant risking her ability to legally drive to the job she'd been complaining about for months, and a small family loan I'd been quietly covering for years. One Harold had taken out for a used truck he needed for a landscaping side business that never quite got off the ground. Slipped into its first missed payment, triggering a call from the bank directly to him. I know all of this not because I was checking on them, but because they made absolutely sure I knew. Text messages, voicemails, one email from Kristen with the subject line, "This isn't fair, Rachel," as if fairness had ever been part of the original arrangement. Marcus called an emergency family meeting at our house, his choice, not mine. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, filing into my living room like a delegation arriving to negotiate a surrender, except they seemed to believe I was the one who owed the apology. Patricia sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her purse in her lap like armor. Harold stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, jaw set. Kristen perched on the armchair, eyes red-rimmed, phone clutched in one hand like a life raft. Patricia spoke first, her voice trembling with something between hurt and accusation. "You knew we depended on that money, Rachel. You knew, and you just turned it off like we don't matter." "No," I said, calm and even. "I was told my money was mine. I'm simply the first person in this family to actually believe it." Harold stepped in, his voice louder, more theatrical. "This isn't about some comment at dinner. This is about family loyalty. We've always treated you like one of our own." I almost laughed at that, but I didn't, because laughing would have given the moment more heat than it deserved. Instead, I looked at him steadily. "Family loyalty," I repeated. Interesting choice of words, considering my father was in the hospital last month and nobody in this room asked how he was doing. Nobody had an answer for that either. Kristen looked down at her phone. Patricia's mouth opened, then closed. Marcus, standing near the doorway, tried to slide into the role of peacemaker. "Rachel, come on. Can't we figure something out?" "Maybe not everything all at once," I said, cutting him off before the sentence could turn into a request dressed up as compromise. I walked to the drawer in the side table and pulled out a folder I'd prepared days earlier, thick with 7 years of printed bank statements, highlighted and organized by category. I set it on the coffee table and opened it slowly, letting the room absorb what they were looking at. Rent assistance, car insurance, utility overages, the roof, the truck loan, the Gulf Coast trip. I read each line item aloud, calmly, without embellishment. $2,800 a month for 7 years. That's just over $230,000. The room went completely silent. Patricia's hand drifted to her chest. Harold's arms uncrossed, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked less like a man delivering a verdict, and more like a man realizing he might be standing trial. Kristen finally spoke, her voice small. "I didn't know it was that much." "None of you did," I said, "because none of you ever asked. You just assumed it would always be there." Marcus stared at the folder like it belonged to a stranger. I closed the folder gently and looked around the room at each of them in turn. "There's one more thing," I said. "You should probably ask Marcus where he told you all this money was coming from." Every head in that room turned toward my husband at once, and for the first time in 7 years, I watched the version of himself he'd built for his family start to come apart at the seams, Patricia turned toward her son slowly, the way people move when they already suspect the answer will hurt and are bracing themselves anyway. "Marcus," she said carefully. "What does she mean, ask you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood there in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Marcus." Harold's voice, lower now, harder. "Where did you tell your mother this money was coming from?" I could have answered for him. I had the statements, the dates, the proof laid out in that folder on the coffee table. But I stayed quiet, because some truths land harder when the person hiding them has to say it out loud themselves. "I told them it was from us," Marcus finally said. "From our joint accounts. I said we were doing well, that I wanted to help out." I repeated softly. "There is no joint account for this, Marcus. There never was. Every transfer came from my personal checking, the one I've had since before we married. You never contributed a single dollar to any of it." Patricia's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like grief. The grief of realizing a story she'd told herself for years had never been true. "You told me you were taking care of us," she said to Marcus, her voice cracking. "You said you were proud you could finally give back after everything we did raising you." "I wanted you to be proud of me," Marcus said. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Before I remembered exactly whose money had purchased that pride, Kristen sat frozen in the armchair, her phone finally forgotten in her lap. "So this whole time," she said slowly, "it wasn't Marcus being generous. It was Rachel's money, and Marcus was just taking credit for it." Nobody answered her, because the silence in the room already had. I walked to the coffee table and opened the folder again, flipping to a specific page I'd tabbed the night before. "Here," I said, pointing to a line from 3 years earlier. "This was the roof repair. Patricia, you told your garden club Marcus really stepped up for you that year. I remember, because you mentioned it at Easter." I looked up at her. Marcus was in Denver for work that entire month. I paid the contractor directly. I have the invoice. Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the folder, as if she needed to see it herself before she could fully believe it. Even with her son standing 3 feet away, confirming every word, the room had shifted completely now. What had walked in as righteous anger toward me had curdled into something far more uncomfortable. A family forced to look at the person they trusted most and realize he'd been quietly rewriting reality for years. At his wife's expense, for his own comfort, Patricia tried weakly to rebuild some version of the argument she'd come in with. "Well, regardless of where it came from, Rachel, family is family. We're still your family. You should want to help." I looked at her steadily, keeping my voice gentle but very clear. "And are my parents your family too, Patricia?" Because when my father was in the hospital last month, nobody in this room asked how he was doing. Nobody sent a card. Nobody even remembered his name. She had no answer. Harold looked down at the carpet. Kristen wiped her eyes, but this time I understood the tears weren't for me, and they weren't really for Marcus either. They were for the sudden absence of a safety net she'd never had to think twice about before. Marcus reached for my arm and gestured toward the kitchen, his voice low and urgent. "Can we talk privately?" I followed him, mostly because I didn't want an audience for what I was about to say either. He closed the door partway behind us, his face tight with something between panic and humiliation. "You're making me look like a liar in front of my entire family," he said. "You are a liar, Marcus. I'm just the reason it's visible now. That's not fair. I just wanted them to think well of me." "You wanted them to think well of you using my money without my knowledge for 7 years, I said. "And when my own father needed help, you stood at that dinner table and told me, in front of everyone, that he wasn't your problem. You built your entire reputation with this family on my paycheck. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice you made over and over again." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Not with the folder still sitting open on the coffee table for anyone to walk past and see. I softened my voice, not out of forgiveness, but because I still needed something from this moment, beyond just being right. "If we're going to talk about money in this family from now on, It's going to be honest. All of it. No more stories. No more credit for things you didn't do. Everyone in that room deserves the truth, including you." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking, looking for the first time since I'd known him genuinely unsure of his footing. I sent the invitations 2 days later, calmly, in writing, no room for anyone to later claim they misunderstood the terms. 1 email to Patricia and Harold, 1 text to Kristen, 1 phone call to my own parents, where I gave them far more warning and far more comfort, because unlike Marcus's family, mine had never once made me feel like an obligation. I also called Denise and asked her to join us. Not as a favor, as a professional. If this family wanted to talk about money, we were going to talk about it with someone in the room who dealt in facts, not feelings. We met on a Sunday afternoon at a small conference room Denise arranged through her office. Neutral ground. No kitchen for anyone to storm off into. No couch cushions to grip like life preservers. Just a long table, water glasses, and enough daylight through the windows that nobody could hide in shadow. My parents arrived first. My father, Arthur, walked in slower than he used to, leaning slightly on my mother's arm, but he wore his good sweater and shook Denise's hand like a man attending an important meeting, which in his own quiet way he understood this to be. My mother, Susan, sat close beside him, hands folded in her lap, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, the way she always has. The contrast was immediate, and I don't think I was the only one who noticed it. Patricia and Harold arrived next, dressed more formally than the occasion required, as if formality might restore some authority they sensed slipping away. Kristen came alone, quieter than I'd seen her in years, her phone left in her bag for once instead of in her hand. Marcus sat beside me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to fill the silence with charm. Denise opened her laptop and walked the room through 7 years of documentation calmly, professionally, without editorializing. Rent contributions, insurance payments, utility overages, the roof, the truck loan, the trip nobody had thanked me for, because nobody had known who to thank. She read the numbers the way an accountant reads numbers, without judgment, which somehow made the judgment land harder than if I'd delivered it myself with tears in my eyes. Harold cleared his throat halfway through, trying to interject. "Look, we appreciate everything Rachel's done. We really do. We just think." "Harold," Denise said gently but firmly, "I'd like to finish the summary first, and then there will be time for everyone to speak." He sat back, visibly unused to being redirected by anyone who wasn't his wife. When Denise finished, the room sat in a silence heavier than any argument. Even Patricia, who had spent a month insisting I was overreacting, looked down at the printed summary in front of her like it belonged to a different family entirely, one far more dependent than she had ever allowed herself to admit. I spoke next, and I kept my voice even, because I'd rehearsed this in my head more times than I'd like to admit. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "I'm here because for 7 years, decisions were made about my money without my knowledge. Credit was taken that wasn't earned, and when my own parents needed help, I was told they weren't anyone's concern but mine. That ends today, not the relationship, the arrangement." Patricia's eyes glistened, but this time, I sensed it wasn't performance. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "I believed my son." "I know," I said, and I meant it gently. "That's exactly the problem. You believed a story instead of asking a single question in 7 years." Harold, to his credit, was the first to say the words nobody else could manage. "We got comfortable," he said, staring at the table. "Comfortable enough not to ask where it came from, as long as it kept coming." Kristen finally looked up, her voice small but honest. "I have to get a second job. I should have had one already. I just never thought I'd need one." I laid out the new terms plainly, the way Denise had taught me to lay out any agreement. Clear, specific, nothing implied. No unconditional support going forward. No transfers without my direct knowledge and consent. No one deciding on my behalf what my family was worth compared to his. Marcus sat through all of it without interrupting, and I watched something settle over his face that looked less like anger now, and more like a slow, uncomfortable arithmetic of his own, not just the money he had lost credit for, but the quiet authority he had always assumed he held over how our finances, and by extension our marriage, would be run. Nobody clapped. Nobody hugged. This wasn't that kind of ending, and I never intended it to be. But when the meeting closed and everyone filed out into the parking lot, Patricia paused beside me for just a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being more honest with us than my own son was." I nodded and let that be enough for now. Marcus walked beside me to the car in silence. And somewhere in that silence, I think we both understood the same truth without needing to say it aloud. The money had only ever been the surface of this. What he was actually losing was the version of control he'd never realized he'd been relying on. There's a particular kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. It just settles in quietly, the way morning light fills a room you've kept the curtains closed on for too long. That's what the weeks after the family meeting felt like. Not triumphant, not vindicated in some loud cinematic way, just quiet, clean mine. I took part of what used to disappear every month into the Doyle family's expenses and redirected it exactly where I'd always wanted it to go. I paid off the remainder of my father's medical bills in full. I hired a contractor to fix the sagging back step my parents had been stepping around for 2 years, the one my mother always said she'd get to eventually. I even set aside enough to send them both on a small trip. Nothing extravagant. Just a few days at a cabin in the hill country, because I realized somewhere along the way that I had spent 7 years funding other people's comfort, and none of my parents' joy. My father cried when I told him about the step. Not loudly. He's not a man who cries loudly. Just a quiet welling in his eyes as he sat in his recliner, waving his hand like he was embarrassed by his own gratitude. "You don't have to do all this, Rachel. We managed before." "I know you did," I said, sitting beside him, taking his hand. "But you shouldn't have to just manage. Not anymore. This isn't charity, Dad. This is love. I finally get to give it the way I always wanted to." He squeezed my hand, and neither of us needed to say anything else. Marcus tried, in his own way, to make things right. He apologized more than once, and I could tell some of it was genuine, buried somewhere under the panic of nearly losing something he'd taken for granted for over a decade. But I noticed something important in those apologies. He kept circling back to the consequences. His mother's disappointment. His sister's financial scramble, the awkwardness at family gatherings. He rarely, if ever, circled back to the actual wound. The fact that he'd stood at our dinner table and dismissed my parents as a problem that wasn't his concern. I didn't rush to forgive him, and I didn't rush to punish him either. I've learned that a boundary held is sometimes its own quiet form of consequence. Sometimes it's simply refusing to go back to how things were, simply because someone finally apologized. I didn't file for divorce, not yet. But I did something I should have done years earlier. I sat Marcus down and laid out new terms for our marriage, the same way Denise had laid out numbers in that conference room. Clear, specific, nothing implied. Separate accounts stayed separate. Major financial decisions required both of us, out loud at the same table. No secret arrangements. No unspoken assumptions about whose family mattered more. And I told him plainly that we needed marriage counseling. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to know if the man sitting across from me was capable of actually changing, or simply capable of being sorry when caught. He agreed to all of it. Whether that agreement holds is still something time will answer. Not me. Meanwhile, the Doyle family adjusted the way people do when a safety net is finally removed, and discover, often to their own surprise, that they're more capable than they thought. Patricia and Harold downsized further, moving into a smaller apartment that fit their actual pension instead of the inflated lifestyle. 7 years of my money had quietly subsidized. Kristen took a second job at a dental office 3 towns over, and the first time she called me, it wasn't to ask for anything. It was simply to tell me, almost sheepishly, that she'd made her first car payment entirely on her own. It felt strange, she admitted. Good strange. Good strange. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. Nobody in that family calls me their emergency fund anymore. Nobody assumes. And strangely, in the space where resentment might have grown, something a little more honest has started to take root instead. Conversations that don't automatically involve money. Boundaries that don't require a folder of bank statements to enforce. A few nights ago, I sat at my parents' kitchen table for dinner. The small one with the wobbly leg my father refuses to let anyone fix because he says it has character. My mother made pot roast. My father told the same story about his fishing trip that he's told 100 times, and I laughed at it like it was the first, because some things deserve that kindness. Halfway through dinner, my phone lit up on the table. Marcus's name. Can we talk? I looked at it for a moment longer than I expected to, feeling the pull of 13 years of habit. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to my mother's pot roast, back to my father's story, back to the people who had never once made me feel like a burden or a transaction. He told me my money was mine, so I finally believed him. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know, where do you think this story goes from here? Do you think Marcus can really change, or has too much already been broken? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss a moment like this.